Howdy folks, this is Brian Grant with CSG Pro. In this video we're going to be looking at row context versus filter context in DAX. This is going to be a visual guide. So let's go ahead and get started, shall we? So to begin, what are our goals here? Well, what we're hoping to do is give you a solid working understanding of the difference between row context and filter context in DAX, two concepts that can be kind of tricky to understand at first. Okay, so with that in mind, let's look at some limitations. So in order to do this, we're going to give you a working understanding. What that means is we're going to simplify things a little bit. Now, you might say to yourself, oh, if we're going to simplify things, that means I'm learning sort of a bad way of understanding this. No, that's not accurate. What you're going to be learning today is enough to get you through beginner and what I would call intermediate DAX. As you get up into the advanced DAX, you're going to want to know more and have a better understanding of these things and get a little bit more nuance. But what we're teaching you today is actually going to give you a lot of mileage, and hopefully you're going to be able to learn it very quickly because we've made those couple simplifications, okay? So, with that in mind, let's create some definitions. So, filter context. What is the filter context? Well, filter context is whenever you ask for a table, okay, filter context is the set of filters that gets applied before the table arrives for use. Okay, so you want a table, say a sales table. You ask for the sales table in code, you write down sales. You might think to yourself, oh, I get the whole sales table. No, that's not accurate. You get the sales table, and as it's coming towards you, if you want to think of it, physically, before it gets to you, the filter context is applied to it to filter it down to just sales for this year, or just sales for last year, or just sales for Canada, or something like that. Okay, so that's what the filter context is. It's the set of filters that gets applied to a table before it gets to you to use it. Okay, now I've got a little asterisk here. See, when you ask for a table, at the very end I'm going to add a few more definitions to that. But for right now, just say, hey, when you ask for a table, doesn't really matter how, filter context is what gets applied to that table before it arrives to you. Okay, that's filter context. Hey, what's row context? Well, row context basically is when you add a column to a table, row context lets a single row's calculations look at the other values in that same row. Okay, now this isn't exactly what it is, but this is a really good place to get started. This is a fantastic starter definition, right? So row context is almost like the current row, right? So when you're adding a calculation to a row, like, I don't know, price times quantity, row context lets each row's calculation for price times quantity look at the price and the quantity for just that row, one row at a time, a process called iteration, okay? Now, you guys don't have to know, like, if you look down at the counter, you'll see this video is not done. You guys don't have to just see these two definitions and say, oh, I get it. I just wanted to let you know right up front that these concepts are not that hard. That's what I want you to take away from both of these definitions, is that it's not rocket science, okay? So now that we've got those two definitions, let's look at another pair of definitions is going to be kind of handy here. Calculate. Okay, well, if you've done any DAX at all, you're at least somewhat familiar with calculate. Calculate, again, is pretty simple. Calculate modifies the filter context, then calculates a number under that new filter context. So calculate has a formula to evaluate, but before it evaluates this formula, it's going to change the filter context. And the second argument, or third and fourth or fifth, and any number of arguments past the first one, are how are we going to change that filter context? So arguments 2 through n of calculate say, hey, how do you change the filter context before evaluating? Then once you've made those changes, you evaluate this formula in argument 1. Okay, simple as that. Sum x. Sum x takes a table, adds a column to it, then sums up that column. Okay, simple as that. Okay, sum x. First argument is, what table are you going to add a column to? Second argument is, what's the formula for the new column? So it takes the table, it adds the new column based on this formula, and then it sums it up. Now, if you're a purist and you're really advanced, you'll know that sometimes there's some optimizations that happen that make that not completely true. But you know what? This is, I think, the correct way to start thinking about it, and this will get you a huge amount of mileage. SumX just takes a table, adds a column to it, and sums up that new column. Simple as that. Okay, so let's get rid of those bottom two definitions. Those we don't need as much. Hopefully you've already seen those a little bit. These are the two we care about most. So let's drop those to the bottom. So we've got a little more room to work. By the way, I think I was supposed to mention it a second ago. This video is best viewed in 1080. I try and record most of my other videos in 720 so that you can watch them on your phone or on a tablet or something like that. Unfortunately, there's just a lot of information I'm going to try and squeeze onto this screen. And in order to do that, we have to record in full 1080. So I hope you're watching in 1080. If you do, it's going to be a much better experience. So there's our definitions down there. Let's start looking at our data model. Well, it's going to be pretty darn simple. We're only going to have two tables. Table numero uno is a sales table, right? I'm just going to call it sale, right? It's got two columns in it, the amount and the name of the person that that bought the product, right? Very, very simple. We're going to try and keep things very simple here, right? Notice there's the column name, amount, and name, and there's sort of the prefix of what table it's in, right? That's sort of a fully qualified name. You might hear it described as such, okay? So pretty simple. Let's look at our second table. We have cust table, or a customers table. So again, we've got two columns, name and country, right? So the country's got what country the customer was from, and the customer name is just the customer name, right? Notice that these two are sort of connected. Like this is how you're going to join these two tables together, is the name of the person that bought the product, and here we have their name right there. So we're going to join on those two things. All right, we're going to create a relationship more specifically. And speaking of that, hey, what's the relationship? Well, it's a simple one-to-many relationship. Okay, so if you're used to Excel, this is sort of what you're going to use the VLOOKUP on, and this is where you're going to write your VLOOKUP. If you like SQL, you're going to sort of left join this table onto this table, right? What's really important here is that each one of these rows here in the customers table, because you know the customer name, you know which country each sale is related to based on this relationship, okay? So now that we've got the data model, let's go look at a pivot table. Ooh, very exciting. Look at that. Okay, now you might be asking yourself, as I would be, that's very cool. We've got a USA sales measure, but without knowing what USA sales measure is, that doesn't help us very much. So let's crack open USA sales measure, shall we? Okay, there's USA sales. Pretty simple. We talked before about calculate and SumX. That was very intentional because USA sales uses calculate and SumX. So let me go down one more time. So because there's a lot of stuff on the screen, I'm going to try and color code these things. Don't worry too much about what it means right now. Just know that I'm doing that intentionally. So if you see red, you can sort of join red to red and purple to purple and orange to orange. That's intentional. Okay. So let's walk through what USA sales actually does. So USA sales starts out here in calculate, right? That's the first thing that gets evaluated. Okay, if you're used to other languages, you might sort of keep going down in the chain of parentheses until you find the lowest level of parentheses. Sort of like algebra, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. You don't do that in DAX. You have to start all the way out, right? You start out and then work your way in, okay? So here at the very top, calculate fires off, and it says, boom, go add USA to the filter context. It's the first thing it's going to do. Calculate. Customer country equals USA. That's going to add USA to the filter context. Next, when that's done, now that we've added it to the filter context, we can go ahead and evaluate this stuff. We're going to go get a view of the sale table, right? SumX says, hey, go get the sale table. And when we get it, we now know that when we reference a table, we don't get this table right here. We get the sale table under the current filter context. Hey, Brian, what's that look like? Well, I'll show you in a second. You got to hold on. We're going to step through these guys first. So, okay, now that we've got sale in the current filter context, which now includes USA, we're going to send this new view into SumX for it to be evaluated. Okay, so we got sale. We put it here in SumX, and we add it all on. We add a column. I'm just going to think of it as X. It's not actually called X. In fact, it doesn't have a name. I just like to think of it as X. So we take the sale table. We add a column X, and the definition for X is this right here, argument 2 of SumX. So we're going to add a column to sale, and it's going to be based on this formula right here. Okay. Then when we're all done, we're going to add up that new column. And that's it. Then we're done. That's how we're going to get this number 19 right here. So with that in mind, let's go look at, let's see, the this thing over here, right? So so what is this thing? This magical thing that sort of shown up here in our plane. Well, this thing is very useful, and if you're not used to DAX, you might not used to be thinking about this. I like to call this the model filter or lens. I don't even know if it has a very specific technical name. But whenever you get a table, right, you're always getting the table in the current filter context. So I like to think of it as when you ask for a table, it sort of passes through this filter or passes through this lens, right, where certain rows get knocked out and certain rows get kept. And when it's all done, we get this view of the table, right, the view of the table in the current filter context. So if you want to get a different view of the table, you have to change what the filter context is, right? That's what calculate does. So now that we've got that, let's go ahead and take these steps and let's throw them out here on our page, right? We're going to go through them one by one. So we're going to add USA to the filter context, get a view of the sales table in the current filter context, send this new view into SumX function to be evaluated, add a column next to this new view using the new formula from argument 2, And finally, sum up this new column. Okay, well, that's what we're going to do. Let's go ahead and get started doing it, shall we? So, step 1, add USA to the filter context. So this is what calculate does, right here on the sort of the outermost function is calculate. First thing it does is add USA to the filter context. More specifically, customer country equals USA to the filter context. So we're going to add this to there. Boom. Easy as that, right? This gets added right there. Okay. Well, done with step 1. That was pretty darn easy. Hey, calculate's a pretty simple function when you get right down to it. Something that's going to be hard to follow, but fundamentally it's pretty simple. So now that we're done with step 1, let's go to step 2. So now we're going to get a view of the sales table in the current filter context, which now includes USA because we added it in step 1. So we're going to get this sales table because that's what sale is right there, right? But we're not just going to grab it. We're going to grab it and it's going to pass through our model filter or lens, right? And have the filter context applied to it before we get that view. So first thing, as you might expect, the sale table goes here into our filter, right? And we get the sales table, right? Cool. Okay, you're probably expecting that. What you might not be expecting is because this customers table is on the one side of a one-to-many relationship with the sales table, right? It's sort of a lookup table for the sales table. These columns are going to come along for the ride as well, right? So boom, these columns are going to come in here as well. It's going to look like that, right? So it's like we did a left join on this table or a VLOOKUP on this table. All of these columns come along for the ride. And that's important because that's how this filter here is going to work, right? Because if I've tried to filter customer country equals USA on this table, well, this table doesn't have that column in it, but this new expanded table does, right? This process is called expansion, right? We're going to add related columns to our initial table. So in this expanded version of the table, we have a column called customer country, and when we apply our filter context, we say, all right, we're only going to keep rows where the customer country is equal to USA. So what rows are those? That's these rows right there, right? 1, 2, 3. Okay, well, those are the rows, so let's go ahead and apply our filter context. Boom, now we've got our new table with only the rows that meet the conditions in the filter context. If there were more conditions here in the filter context, we'd probably get less rows, okay? So now that we've applied our filter context, we can go ahead and sort of return that view. Boom, there you go. There's the view we're going to get. So when we ask for sale here in this part of our DAX formula, we get this, it passes through here, and we end up with this table right here. This is what gets passed into SumX. Okay, so we've gotten a view of sales table in the current filter context. That's that right there. So now we're going to send this. We're going to send this new view of the table over to SumX. Okay, well here's SumX, right? There's the sale that we just got a second ago. Let's throw it in there. We're going to make ourselves a little space, and boom, there we go. Visually represented, right? So here's the view we just got, and SumX is going to say, okay, take this view of the sale table that we just got in the current filter context and add a column to it. Well, what's the new column? It's going to be based on that formula right there, right? And when we're done, we're going to add up that column. But first, before we could add the column up, gosh, we got to add it. Well, with that in mind, let's move on to step 4. Add a column. I'm just going to think of it as X. It's not technically called X. It's going to be around for such little time that we're not going to bother to name it, okay? It's an anonymous column. So we're going to add a column to this new view using argument 2, right? Well, let's get started doing that. Here's our table right there. So we're going to add this column. I'm going to think of it as X, and it's got 3 values in it, all right? Well, we have to, one by one, evaluate these values. We have to go get it. 1, 2, 3, the 3 values for this new column. Well, let's start with the first one. So, what's the formula here for this new column? Well, sale amount plus 0. Okay, so here's where row context comes into play. Okay, so technically right now, if we don't have row context, sale amount refers to an entire column, right? It's this entire column right here. It's not one value, it's 3. So if we try and add 0 to it, we're going to get an error because we're not getting one answer, we're getting 3 answers. That's going to confuse DAX. But because we're in a current row context, bam, sale amount no longer refers to the entire column, but just the value of that column in the current row, right? So sale amount now refers to just 8 because that is the value for sale amount in the current row. Now, again, this is a simplified explanation. If you get really advanced, it's a little more complicated than this, but this is a great working definition. I think this is really going to help you understand it, and you go a long way before the simplifications start to sort of unravel a little bit and actually cause you problems. This is a fantastic understanding of row context. It's almost like the current row. In fact, you could just think of it as the current row for right now, right? So for row 1, sale amount plus 0, well, what is that? 8 plus 0, because sale amount is evaluated in the current filter context. So 8 plus 0 equals 8, and we get 8. Okay, boom. Now let's go to the next value we're going to evaluate. And once again, there's our formula, same as before. But now we have a different row context, right? When we evaluated the same formula up here, sale amount plus 0 meant 8 plus 0. But now that we're evaluating it down here, the row context is different because we're in a different row, okay? So because of that, sale amount no longer equals 8, it equals 4. That's the amount value for sale amount here in the current row context, okay? So now we get 4 plus 0, that's just 4. Hey, easy. Great. So we get 4. So I think you see where this is going, but it's useful to do it a couple times. Let's go get the value for the third row. Well, formula, same as it's always been, right? And that's pretty important. Notice it's always the same exact formula, but we get different answers because we're doing it in a different row context each time. So when we evaluate this one, because we're iterating over a table, we're looking at the value for just this row, right? So these values here are essentially added to the row context. That's sort of a good technical way to think of it, right? So when we're evaluating sale amount plus 0, this value and this value and this value and this value get added to the row context. So when you ask for sale amount, you're looking at exactly one number, okay? So here sale amount is equal to 6 plus 0, so we get 6 plus 0, well that's just 6, and boom, we get 6, okay? Easy as that, not terribly complicated. So now specifically, there's always exactly one row context at a time, right? So there's always a filter context and always a row context. But you'll notice as we stepped through adding this column to the table, we ended up with 3 different sort of versions of the row context, right? So you can imagine before we started adding this first value right here, the row context was empty. When we started adding the first value, all the values from this row over here got added to the row context, right? Then when we got this 8, it sort of dumps those values out of the row context. Then when we start evaluating this value right here, it adds all this stuff to the row context so that sale amount now equals 4 instead of 8, okay? It gets the value and it dumps all that stuff out of the row context. Then when it evaluates this value here, the third one, it adds all this stuff to the row context, evaluates the formula, gets 6, and then dumps all this stuff out of the row context. So there's sort of several changes that happen. The row context, in this particular instance, took on 3 different, almost personas, if you will. It changed a couple different times, right? So there's always one row context, but here it had 3 different states, right? One for each row when we iterated over this table, okay? Gosh, and that's the hard stuff, right? So now that we've got that, all we have to do is sum up this new column. Well, there's the table, there's the column. Sum up our new mystery column, column X, the unnamed column, the anonymous column. And that is just, if you're not a math major, 8 plus 5 plus 6 equals 19. And that value right there is equal to that value right there, okay? So that is the entire process right there, right? So, and that's sort of the key difference, right? Filter context is whenever you ask for a table, right? You don't get, or whenever you ask for a table from the model, you don't get the sort of the table as it is in the model. It has to pass through the filter context first, and you get a view of the table. So filter context affects the view of any given table that you ask for, right? The version of any given table that you ask for, the subset of any given table that you ask for, right? That's what filter context is all about. Row context really only comes into play when you're adding a column to a table, right? When you're iterating over a table, right? And what row context says is it has nothing to do with filter context. It just says, hey, when you're calculating a value for a certain row, it's for a single row, all the other values in that row get added to the row context so that you can sort of ask for them by name. So that what would normally be a column reference that references a bunch of values now only references the values from that current row, okay? So that's row context, again, as opposed to filter context. Filter context is all about getting views from the model, right? You ask for a table in the model, you get a view of it. Row context is you add a column to a table, right? For each value, individual value in that new column, when it gets calculated, the formula can look at just that current row. That's row context. Okay, so I'm going to add one small little couple things here. To our definition, we're going to say, hey, when you ask for a table, I had this little asterisk in there. It's been there forever. There's a couple different ways you can ask for a table that I know about. So asking for a table includes naked table references, which is like what we got right here, where you just ask for the sale table by itself. Whenever you ask for just a table by writing it out, hey, it's going to pass through the model filter or the model lens and get you a view of the table, right? Filter context gets applied. This is also true if you use a values function or a distinct function. So if I do like the, oh gosh, I don't know, the value of the sale name column, right? Like let's say that that's the thing that I ask for of, value of sale name. I'm not just going to get all the distinct values of this table. I'm going to get that, but then it's going to get passed here through the model lens, and it's going to have the filter context applied to it, right? So the filter context gets applied whenever you ask for a table. Whenever you ask for the values of a column, or the distinct values of a column, that's the way I like to think about values. Or if you get the distinct function of a specific column. What's the difference between values and distinct? For a novice beginner user, don't worry about it. There's no difference. Don't worry about it right now. There's a slight differences dealing with referential integrity, but if that sounds like it's sort of out of the scope of this video, hey, you're right. That is out of the scope of this video. So don't worry about that. Just know that filter context gets applied whenever you ask for a table sort of just by name, whenever you ask for the distinct values of a column using the values call, or whenever you ask for the distinct values of a column using the distinct function. Okay? Also, as I sort of said before, there's always a row context, but it usually starts, you can think of it as starting empty, and it gets filled up when it iterates through a table, right? So for each row, when it's iterating through a table, it gets filled up with that row's values, the formula gets evaluated, and then it dumps those values. Then it goes to the next row, where it fills up the row context with that row's values, evaluates the formula, and then dumps those values out again, right? So that is all about row context. Okay, so if you want to know more about this, boy, there's a billion places to read about this. I think one of the best guides that I've seen is from the Definitive Guide to DAX. This is sort of the DAX Bible, BI with Microsoft Excel, SQL Server Analysis Services, and Power BI, from Marco Russo and Alberto Ferrari. Gosh, if you don't have this book on your shelf and you want to learn more about DAX, you should get it pretty quickly. This is an amazing book. And there's Chapter 4, Understanding Evaluation Context. Now, the thing about this book is it could be a little dense. And so hopefully by watching this video, right, you'll be able to sort of go at this book, and it'll be less painful, right? It'll just be less hard, because this is just fundamentally difficult stuff. But hopefully I've taken some of that stuff and made it a little bit easier here today. But please do go get this amazing book. Okay, well, we have reached the end of our exploration of filter context and row context here inside of DAX. I'd like to take a special moment to give a very special thanks to Rachel Dyer, whose excellent work on this particular subject really made this video possible. So, special thanks to her. So, from all of us here at CSG Pro, thank you very much for watching. We do hope you enjoyed the video, and we will see you next time.